Okay, we're starting with Shiur and סימן Shin Tzaddik Aleph, and Hashem, next week we'll try to do Shin Tzaddik Beis and whatever's left from until the end of Hilchos Ceiruv Chatzeros. The סימן begins by saying that all the dinim which apply to someone who forgets to do Erev Chatzeros, same thing applies to somebody who forgets to do Shituf Mevoyos. And the way it works is you have one Chatzer. So therefore, if one Chatzer forgot to do Shituf Mevoyos with the other Chatzeros, after that Chatzer did its own Erev within themselves, that Chatzer could mevatel its Reshus to other Chatzeros, and then that Chatzer, the people of that Chatzer are considered Oirchim towards the people who are in the rest of the Mavoi. And even though usually by Chatzeros we say that the Rabbim are not considered Oirchim to a Yachid, over here we say it's not a problem because over here we look at every Chatzer as one unit. When it comes to Shituf Mevoyos, just like by a Chatzer, when we say Rabbim cannot become Oirchim to a Yachid, Rabbim is each individual house. Over here we look at the Chatzer as one unit. So even though the Chatzer has a bunch of people in the Chatzer, we still look at it as one unit, and therefore it's not considered that the Rabbim are Oirchim by a Yachid. Rather, it's a Yachid which is an Oreach by everybody else, and therefore it is fine. And what is the definition of it? Why? How is this? Because we look at it, in essence, we look at the opening of a Mavoi. That means we look at the opening of a Chatzer. We say, being that the Chatzer has one entry into it, therefore it is considered like one unit, like one house inside the Chatzer. So one Chatzer within a group of Chatzeros in a Mavoi, since that Chatzer has one door, it's to say one entrance, it's considered the same as a house within a Chatzer, one unit. That's the reason of the Alter Rebbe why one Chatzer is one Chatzer that forgot to be Ma'arev. That one Chatzer that forgot to be Mishtatef in the Shituf Mevoyos could mevatel themselves to the rest of them. Now, when you look at the Mishnah Berurah and Sefkat Nalaf, he says that the reason is because the Chatzer all did already an Erev. Being that they did an Erev, they became a Yachid. And that's what he brings that in the name of the Gra. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention B'chlal this concept that it became a Yachid because there was an Erev, but rather, Alter Rebbe mentions the reason that it's because there's one entryway from the Chatzer outwards. The nafkamina that would come out between these two reasons would be a simple nafkamina, that according to the Gra and the way the Mishnah Berurah understands it, the only way one Chatzer could mevatel its reshus to the Bnei Hamavoi is by if the Chatzer did an Erev before. Alter Rebbe mentions that it's based on the design of the Chatzer, and therefore lav davka, that if they forgot even to do an Erev between themselves, that these guys cannot be mevatel themselves to the rest, but I'm not paskening on that now. Alter Rebbe continues, anything which is relevant to a goy when it comes to a Chatzer, the Hainu that we say if it's two Yidden in the same Chatzer together with the goy, then the goy is oyser on them. Same thing applies in Shitufei Mevoyos, which means that if you have a city which is filled with goyim and it has only one Chatzer of Yidden, then they could carry in the whole city if it's Mukaf Chayma. Yeah, if it's kosher for carrying for a different reason, if it's closed off, completely closed off, then the people, the Yidden, if they're only in one Chatzer, they could carry in the rest of the city because they are considered as one, klape the rest of the goyim. But if there is two independent Chatzeres of Yidden in a city of goyim, then you already have to do schiras reshus, because these guys are oiser, these two chatzeres are like two yidden which are oiser one on another. Just important to remember, it's not written over here, we mentioned that a building by definition is also a chatzer. The way Tzemach Tzedek explains it, even a house with more than one unit, 2 units in a house, or rented or owned by 2 separate people, is already considered its own chatzer. So realistically, to say that you have a city where you only have one chatzer of Yidden, you carry in the whole city, would only be if there will be one building full of Yidden without any goyim, and then there'll be goyim in the whole rest of the city without any other Yidden anywhere else. Now what happens afterwards? You have to then go, since you have more than one chatzer, which means you have more, so to speak, more than one Yidden living with a goy, you have to do schiras reshus from every single goy in town, which we're soon going to discuss. That is in Seif Aleph. That is a summary of Seif Aleph. Seif Beis comes into this idea that you have a city which has chatzeres, which has 2 chatzeres of a yid, 2 separate chatzeres of a yid, and therefore you have to do schiras reshus. You have to be seicher reshus from each and every single guy in town. And the mechaber's lashon is that the schirus misar ha'ir does not help anything. Just to point out before we continue weiter, there's a Chaya Adam in Klal Ayin Hey Seif Chaf Aleph, who he points out that if you have a bunch of goyim living in one chatzer, we don't say the same rule as by a yid, that they are considered as one, and therefore you could rent from only one goy, but rather if you have a chatzer full of nachrim, you have to do schiras reshus from each and every single goy in the chatzer. And but that again, that fits with the shitta of the Gra and the Mishnah Berurah, that you have that the chatzer, the reason for a chatzer is because of an eruv. So when you have a bunch of goyim living in a chatzer, there is no eruv between them, which makes them as to one unit. Now, Rebbe defines a chatzer as one unit because of the entryway. There's only one entryway over there. It's one entry-exit point. Then l'cha'ira, in this scenario, even if there's a bunch of goyim in one building, that in one chatzer, you would be enough to rent from one goy. Now, the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch adds a Yeshayimrim, that this idea that the Mechaber writes that when you have a schiras, when you have a bunch of nachrim, you can't rent from the Sar Ha'ir, only applies with regards to the houses, because the houses is each one independently. So if you want to carry into the guy's house, then you can't rent from the Sar Ha'ir. It's not working?
No, the lights are low. It's much lower than usual.
So, okay, it doesn't make a difference. Do they only see my nose? Yeah, that's good. If there is a the Ramah says it only refers to batim, but in a mavoi you could rent the mevoyos, the streets you could rent from the Sar Ha'ir. Why? Because the Sar Ha'ir has the power to throw all the goyim out of the mavoi. The Taz Sifkot and Gimel has an issue with the Ramah, and he said, and the Taz over there concludes that only a Sar that has the power to go into your house and put people during the war, then you could rent from him, and if not, not. And he disagrees with the Ramah. Alter Rebbe does not even mention this Ramah as a Yeshayimrim. He only mentions the shitta of the Mechaber, by the way. He does not mention the Ramah Bichlal over here, which pretty much seems clearly to imply that it's not even as a Yeshayimrim. The Alter Rebbe paskins that you cannot separate the houses from the street, and if you can't do schiros from Sar Ha'ir, it doesn't work even for the streets, even if you don't carry in and out of the goyim's houses. Now, Taz himself continues that even if you have a minister who collects taxes from the people of the city, it's still not enough to rent from him. Why? Because he does not have the power to take away your property. Happens to be that the vast majority of the Achronim hold like the Ramah, not like the Alter Rebbe. The Mishnah Berurah and Sifkot and Yudbeis says that everybody was Machriya like the Ramah, but we know the Alter Rebbe clearly was not Machriya like the Ramah. He was Machriya like the Shulchan Aruch and like the Beis Yosef, and doesn't even mention the Ramah. The Alter Rebbe then continues that this only applies if the houses do not belong to the minister, to the king, and he has no right to use these houses even during a time of war. And even if it's a time of war and he wants to put the soldiers in, he can't do it, the minister can't do it on his own accord. Rather, he has to get permission from the king. He has to get permission from the people. And then he has to get permission from the king and from the ministers. But if the minister of town or the king is the one who calls all the shots in the city, and he could put people into your house shaloi against your will during time of war, then you could rent from this sar or from this king, or even from schiroi lekitoi of this king. And the Alter Rebbe again over here adds for the fourth time, or third or fourth time, that schiroi lekitoi means hadar beveisoi. They're talking about schiroi lekitoi that's living in the house of the minister, or the house of the king, and not stam an employee, and therefore, anybody who has reshus to put something into the house of the guy also is considered a schiroi lekitoi, and the schiroi lekitoi of a schiroi lekitoi is an employee of an employee is also considered a schiroi and lekitoi. Now I'm going to go,
The base over here is a kula. He doesn't have to have the right to actually make the chayil go, as long as he's just dar beisa.
Yeah, the dar beveisa of the sar.
Yeah.
The sar has the right to put the chayolim in.
No, I'm saying that even dar beisa, which is not, doesn't have the right to.
Yeah, he's employed by the person who has the right to do it. Now, I want to first start with the Tzemach Tzedek when it comes to sar, and then we'll deal with other ones. There's tshuva of Tzemach Tzedek, which I printed in your book, which is in Choshen Mishpat. Page 74 in your white book. It's Siman Memches Memtes. It's not connected to Hilchos Ceirovin, but it is connected to. It's in Choshen Mishpat. Obviously, it's not discussing Hilchos Ceirovin, but it's important to see over there. The discussion over there was about they used to have people who had the rights to sell certain things, the rights to collect taxes. The Tzemach Tzedek goes through the whole discussion over there. And the Tzemach Tzedek answers the Rav in Siman Memches, and the Rav asked the question on the Tzemach Tzedek. I think the questions were published in Yagdal Torah. They found them later. And then Siman Memtes, the Tzemach Tzedek responds back to the person who asked the question. Now, in Ois Beis of Siman Memtes, the Tzemach Tzedek goes into a discussion of when a king owns the land and he lets a person use the land over there, and he says that it's not like a masker. You don't say it's like a masker, like a renter, that the king still has ownership rights to the land. Rather, we look at it as that it's a full kinyan. That means when the king gave you that land, it becomes fully yours. The only difference is that the king retained a specific right that he could go and collect taxes and use and maybe take the house on the right of the taxes. But it becomes a full kinyan. It's not considered that the king has ownership rights on it. And one of the things that in between the discussion over there towards the end of Sif Beis, the Tzemach Tzedek mentions the Bach over here in Siman Shin Tzadik Aleph, that you cannot do schiris from Sar Ha'ir, even if the Sar Ha'ir has reshus to put his kalim over there. Why? Because B'poyel, the Sar Ha'ir, is not the owner of your house. Rather, all he is he has a schus, he has a certain right to put things in your house. And that's the proof that the king is not really the owner, even if he has a right to put things in your house. He's not really the owner. And so Tzedek says, the Bes Yosef over here in Siman Shin Tzaddik Aleph is mekel, that you could rent from a king that has a right to put things in your house. That's only le'inyan. That's only because the moment a person has a right to put something in your house, he becomes like your schiru lekitay. So if the king has a right, or the minister has a right to put something in every single person's house, it doesn't mean that he becomes the owner. It means that he becomes your schiru lekitay. The king becomes the employee. The minister is the employee of the people. And therefore, he has a right to rent it out to do the schirus. Yeah. And he says, even there, the Chacham Tzvi has an issue with it. And that's what it continues in this. No. And he says that the king is considered a muhzak in the karkois, in the discussion of it, has nothing to do with bailus, but it's only because the king has a right that if you don't pay taxes, he can take and sell your house. And that's how it continues in Eis Gimel. It only applies to a king that has the power to sell the house when you don't pay taxes. And the reason is because the ikar karka, the land is originally his, and therefore, since when a king has that the land is also fully his, and not only the kumaniach kelim, that's when he has a chazaka. But that's only the king and not the saroir. The saroir doesn't have the same power as the king, even if he has the rights to collect taxes, and even if he has the right to take away your house for payment of taxes. Soon going to see, since the ikar karka is not his, the schiras reshus doesn't help from the sar. It's pretty clear from the Tzemach Tzedek that schiras from saroir never helps. And from a king, it only helps when the king has the power to sell has the ownership rights of the land, and therefore has the power to sell the property. And not only that he could maniach kelav, and therefore, if you look simply at Tzemach Tzedek, all the heterim that I use today for schiros from anybody doesn't really help unless you have to deal with schiru lekitay from a different reason. But if you take what Alter Rebbe takes out the whole saroir for the streets, and it's Tzemach Tzedek Bechlal doesn't hold of the saroir today having any rights in today's way to sell it, to rent it out.
Even schiru lekitay. I understand. If he could put in kelim.
If he could put in kelim, he has a right to put in kelim without your permission. Then you gain permission. Then mitzat schiru lekitay works. Now I want to go through a bunch of interesting points in Rishonim and Achronim which are relevant to this, and then we'll see whether any of them have any practical application today, after we already know what the Alter Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek holds. So let's start. There's a tshuva of the Rashba, Chelek Hey Siman Daled, that a sar ha'ir, even if that the reason why you can't rent from a saroir is because the saroir doesn't have a right to throw you out of the house. However, even if the saroir has a right to throw you out of the house, but he has to pay you for it, then it doesn't help. Why? Because the person is considered. It's until he receives payment for it is considered like his, and the fact that the minister can take it away from him doesn't mean that it is always his. It means when he pays for it, he could get it. So that knocks off, the Rashba knocks off the whole idea that people think that just because the government has a right for eminent domain, then you could be rent from the government. Why? Because eminent domain, again, you have to pay for taking the property. So according to the Rashba, that's not going to work. Now, if you can take the house for not paying taxes, which is something, the house becomes a mashkin for the tax, or you could take which we saw already mentioned in Tzemach Tzedek, you could take it. But the Tzemach Tzedek says that it's only when the Iker Karka belongs to the king, and then he could take it, then it works, but if not, not. So the Shas Tshuva Sheilo Meishiv, Chelik Beis Siman Samach Beis, that he holds that it's fine if automatically, pretty much on the Mashmos, is if you don't pay taxes, the king automatically gets your property, then it works. However, that again doesn't apply today, because even if you don't pay taxes, and the government will initiate collections, until they foreclose on your property and they take it, they're still not theirs. So again, it's not automatically theirs. It's a choiv that you owe. You own the house. You owe the government a choiv, and the government has a mashkin on your choiv, on your house. So now you don't pay your choiv. The bank, the government could take it, but it doesn't mean that the city has any ownership rights in it. The same thing, you can't say that you could go and schiru l'kite from the banks. You could take a schiru l'kite of the banks because the bank has a right. If you don't pay the mortgage, to take away your house. The house is yours. Just like taxes, also the house is yours. And if you don't pay it, the government has a right to take it away. So that also doesn't work. Now, happens to be the Sefer Kol Boy and Hilchos Ceirovin, the Chelik Aleph Perik Tes Sif Yud Ches, he over there explains why it doesn't work, and he explains over there why it doesn't work, even if they could take it for tax purposes, and he bases it on the way the Mishnah Brura explains the Mechaber, which we already know, the Alter Rebbe Paschal is the Mechaber, and the Rashba, which I already mentioned to you before, and the Bach, and Chacham Tzvi, and a bunch of other Chacham Tzvi that Tzemach Tzedek mentioned, and a bunch of other people. So this, again, even if it would work, even before today's day and age where it becomes a debt, even according to them, he explains it still doesn't, he's medayik, it still doesn't work. Now, there is a very, very interesting chkira, but it's derech agav chkira, from Chaim Kanievsky about the schiros from Sar Ha'ir. In his book, Karyana de Igris Chelik Beis Igeres Tzadik Vav, he says that the fact, even if a king has a right to put soldiers in your house, that doesn't give him, that's lav davka, that's a proof that he has ownership on the house. You have to be able to prove that he has ownership on the house. The fact that he has a right to put a soldier in your house just means that as the king, he has a right to force you to do something for the benefit of the country. Forcing you as a person. It's not ownership rights in the house. He could force you to give him something. He could force you to give you taxes. He could force you to feed the soldiers. He could also force you to host the soldiers. But it doesn't give him any ownership rights in it. So he says that in today, the way today's systems work, that even if there is a king which has a right to put soldiers in your house, it's still, schiros wouldn't help because he doesn't have a right, ownership rights. All he has is the right to impose on the citizens certain restrictions that they have to take care of. Now we'll take to the other extreme about what's Schiru L'Kite. We're going to move to discuss Schiru L'Kite. The Shas Tshuva is Har Tzvi from Herr Shveisach Frank, the Rav in Yerushalayim, in Siman Yud Zayin. He says that in democratic societies, how does it work? The mayors are chosen by the people. There's elections. What's the purpose of you choosing somebody? Every politician will tell you that he's elected to serve the people. No politician will tell you he's going in there to be able to make money off it or for all the other stuff that they do, but even though it's what they do. But that's not what they tell you they do. The purpose of it is they're elected to serve. So if they are elected to serve, then be'etzim they become the Schiru L'Kite of every single person in the city. That's what the Shas Tshuva's Har Tzvi says. So he says, happens to be in today's democracies, you have a different angle for the heter. The heter of the mayor is not mitzad that he has any rights in the city. Fakert. It's because you voted him in. Every single person in the city had the right to be participating in the elections, and especially if you live in a place where they don't ask you for ID before you vote, so then everybody could vote. So that's for sure not a problem. So he's mamish miyatzeg every single person in the city.
What if you don't vote for him?
Still, you have a right to vote. You have the right to vote.
he's volunteering to be schirit l'kita, but you're not accepting his...
You are, because you're lazy to go vote. So you have the right to go vote. He represents you. He is your schirit l'kita. Huh?
You voted for the other guy.
So you voted for the other guy, but the fact you participate in the elections, by you voting doesn't mean that you only accept the jurisdiction of the mayor if the guy that you win wins. Or the loike das atayim in Lachrena. But
you could run from the president of the whole country.
So you could run, no, because the president is not the whole country. States have their own rights and cities have their own rights.
We're all elected to serve us. So in a certain way, it's that's the sort of. Taka doesn't have all the rights over us, but neither.
Yeah, so the whole, technically, yeah, but in America, there's no such thing as the president has no rights on state, doesn't have that much rights on federal government, doesn't have rights on state.
That's not the Sfarad. The Sfarad is that the mayor was elected to serve you.
The mayor was elected to serve you in the city, so therefore...
To a certain extent, the president also...
Kan zijn. He mentions the mayor. Happens to be that Hatzvi says, it's not his own chiddush. The Divrei Malkiel, Chelik Gimel, Siman Yitches says that about a king. So he doesn't say the king because he was elected. He says a king because it says in Gemara that that means a king is your Eved. And therefore, a king B'etzim is also Schirit l'kita of everybody else. A certain Lubavitch Rav who told me...
But if the king is Schirit l'kita, then how would it work if he has full rights? If he has full rights to be Chayal, then he's considered like the Balbas, not just like Schirit l'kita.
But Chaim Kanievsky says it doesn't work. He only has a right to impose on you, to put soldiers in your house, impose on you, not on your house. Doesn't have ownership in the house. And also, the Masadek also is not so clear about that it works.
Oh, yeah?
Doesn't seem like it. You can put people in, but what rights do you have? If you look at the Masadek, but it doesn't seem so clear. The Masadek holds that in today's day and age, the Masadek seems to base it on Kinyan Karka. Huh?
Putting kin, not about the...
Same thing, is similar to Chayal.
How do you go against Shalom? Shalom is clear, Chayal work.
But what does it mean that Chayalim work? Why could the king put Chayalim into your house? Because he owns it? Or because you gave him the right to put it in there? Or because he forces you to put them in there, but not because he owns it? The Yesod over there, you have to understand, this is something that today you don't even get it. Amal, everything was owned by the king. Or the Partits, or wherever it is. He owned everything. He had a right, he had a right to put you in there. He had a right to throw out all the Yidden whenever he felt like it. And they did it every few years, depending on which country. And he had a right to impose new taxes. That's a whole discussion of Dinah de Malchusa, Dinah, if it applies to what taxes, if it's specifically on the Jews. But he did. They did put taxes on the Jews and put restrictions on the Jews. They picked on the Jews and they picked on the Goyim also. The whole idea of Puritzim, that was a whole rebellion in Europe, the serfdom. They abolished the concept that a person owns land, and then later they abolished the concept that a person owns people. And now, I have a certain Lubavitch Rav who told me that this Yesod, that you could that the people who are voted in or who are elected Schirit l'kita, he says that's shtickle b'chiddush. But he says the employees of the city which service you are for sure your Schirit l'kita. He tells me,
How's it based anyway?
What?
How's it based?
How's what?
Even the head of the Har Tzvi.
Yeah.
They don't have the mayor can't go into your house and do anything in your house.
Well, he's your employee.
But doesn't have to be able to put in your house.
Your employee is Schirit l'kita. So Alter Rebbe says beveisei. Not everybody else puts the beveisei over there. Not Alter Rebbe.
What about a super? Super is working for you or
or working for the management company. But if I own a house in New York, I pay taxes. Part of the taxes goes for the garbage, the sanitation department. So this Rav told me that the one person you could rent from is the sanitation department. The sanitation department is Schirit l'kita every single person in the city.
But they're saying this is even no Alter Rebbe?
Huh?
This is even no Alter Rebbe?
Couldn't Alter Rebbe have a problem because that's Schirit l'kita shebeveisei. Okay, so don't carry in parentheses. Also says, but the Poel Alter Rebbe puts it in there, right? So he puts it, Hadar Schirit shebeveisei. What does shebeveisei mean? that he lives there, or that he has something in there, something along those lines. Now, Bechlal, you look in the Oitzer Halachas that is on Hilchos Ceiruv, and he brings all the shittas, all the shittas of Mikelas over there. He also mentions the garbage collecting people. He also brings over there that fire department you could rent from, because the fire department has the only government body which has a right to break into your property without your permission is the fire department. If there's a chashash of a fire and you could say no from today to tomorrow, they will break into your property. Police does not have that right. They have to have a warrant, and you could not let them in.
With the warrant,
if they have reasonable doubt that there's a crime happening in your house, they would be able to break in and think, no?
Yeah, but love dafka.
Huh?
Love dafka.
Love dafka?
You have to show a warrant. It's part of the thing.
Reasonable doubt, that's my surprise.
I don't know. If someone calls, they knock on the door. Then this Oitzer Halachas brings another big chiddush, that if you have the gas companies, they have a meter in every single house, so therefore they have something in your house, so it does work. And it's also, they could come in to take care of their gas meter, and b'mitzias, that's mufrach, because a gas meter, the most they do, they'll put a tag on your door that they came and they want to come in, and they'll come again and again, and if you don't let them in, they'll disconnect your gas, they'll give you a fine. But they're not going to actually break into your house to service the gas meter. So that's another person that you could rent from, according to some opinions. Then but again, all these schiru lekitos are become an issue because the Alter Rebbe says beveisei. So unless you take out the beveisei from the Alter Rebbe, you have a problem with all these kinds of schiru or lekitos, that unless these schiru lekitos have a right to go into your house have a right to go into your house or in your house. Now, based on the Ramah, which says that you could rent from the king the streets, even if you don't rent from him even if you can't rent the houses, you could rent from him the streets. Based on that, in this book Kolboy on Hilchos Ceiruv, Chelik Aleph Perek Tes Ha'ore Zayin, is medayik from the way the Mishnah Brura Sifkat Nidal understands the Ramah, that if you have a government body that has a right to close the streets, to redirect the streets, to block traffic, to repair the streets, they're responsible for it, you could rent from them the streets. So in New York, will be the Department of Transportation, and that they have those rights, and you would be able to rent from them just the public areas. But again, that's only based on the Ramah, and we have a problem with that, because Alter Rebbe doesn't mention the Ramah Bechlal, and which also creates a problem. How could you make schiras reshus in a city when you have if the goyim over there, just the streets separate from the houses doesn't really work according to the Alter Rebbe. Now, does it work? Does schiros of the Sad Ha'ir work also for Yidden who are Mechalei Shabbos? So if we look in Shas Shuvas, the Kan Ara in Chelik Erechaim Siman Chav Beis, and Shas Shuvas Beis Shloima Erechaim Siman Nun Hey, he says that it works also for Jews who are Mechalei Shabbos. However, I think the Beis Shloima is the one who mentions that you have a different problem, because by a guy, Schiras Reshus helps you in Pachas Mishaveh Pruta. By a Yid, who's Mechal Shabbos, so Shiloh say you need the Pruta. He says, Mecheshben, how many Yidden and Mechal Shabbos are in town to be able to do the Prutas for all these people for the Schiras Reshus. Shenka by a guy, it could be any minimal amount. So if you want to include the Yidden and Mechal Shabbos in the Schiras Reshus, you would have a problem mitzad the amount that you have to pay for the schiros. Now, what happens if the schiru lekitoi, we went through this in the past, the schiru lekitoi of the guy is a yid. So most achronim hold that it's fine. It's mashma from the Alter Rebbe in Siman Shin Pei Beis that it's also fine because Alter Rebbe says over there that a Yid becomes a friend with a guy, and then he gets Rishus to put things in his house, and then he becomes, Gemara, yeah. But some people say that even though it says that's an exception to the rule, only in that specific case. The Alter Rebbe is not, doesn't discuss the concept of a regular Schiru Lekitoi of a goy being a Yid, but it doesn't say it doesn't work. There are some, I don't remember now offhand, but there are some Achrenim which hold that the Schiru Lekitoi of a goy does not, a Schiru Lekitoi of a goy who, if a Yid is a Schiru Lekitoi, it doesn't work. And most of them hold that it's fine. It's written like that in the Beis Shloimeh, Siman and Hey, and Sheil Meishav, and Chasal Azar, that it does work.
Say that by a Yid that's Mechal Shabbos, so even though he's a girl, he's considered a girl Chol Davar,
Shavah Pruta, yeah.
So he's a girl Chol Davar just Lagabe.
Yeah, Lagabe Surim, not Lagabe Mammon.
The fact that you're renting it just from Skidder Lekitoi, then that he's not. He's considered a guy, but not the guy who showed Pruta.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Lamaisa, based on that, we have a big problem with all the modern day Eiruvim, which rely on schirus from any of the government bodies, because they don't get, there is no body today which has a fire department, maybe, which has either the fire department or if you want to use the sanitation department, the Schiru Lekitoi. But they have a right to go in.
According to Chaim Kanievsky's,
if you think that is the fire,
according to Chaim Kanievsky's diuk, when it comes to the king, the fire department wouldn't work either. Same idea. They only have a right to deal with fires. They don't have any ownership rights. Right. So he's according to that, you have a big problem. But even before we get to that, today's Eiruvin, let's say you make an Eiruvin in a city, and the city has goyim. You're not doing Schiros Rishus from every guy. It's not shaykh to do Schiros Rishus from every guy. So you want to do Schiros Rishus from Saroir, right? And you want to cover all the streets, so you can carry in the streets. But then you can't carry, for sure you can't carry into the guy's properties. And you can't carry into Yidden Mechal Shabbos' properties, because the Schiros Rishus didn't help for sure for them, only helps with the streets. And then if you have Yidden who dafka don't want to be part of the Eirov, you also have a problem.
With that.
Huh?
With that.
You can't carry into their houses. You carry only from, even if you say, it works, it only works to carry from a Yid who is maskim to use Eirov to a Yid who's also maskim to use Eirov. You can't force yourself into somebody who doesn't hold the Eirov, because he's not maskim. He's like a goy for this purpose.
wait, why did the Oyster even in the streets? Should be Oyster even in the streets? Because you can't do Skirkit.
Yeah, so you have a shayla. That's another problem. You might.
In his house, even in the street, it should be a problem.
You might have a problem in the streets because he's open, if his reshus is open to the street, yeah? Unless there's a gate separating him from the street. But ultimately, you look in the same book that I gave you, there's a letter from the Rebbe on page 142 to Harav Moshkovich, who was the one who did the Eid of Manhattan. Interesting letter over there, where the Rebbe's Lashon, I'm going to read you the Lashon in a second. This letter was written at the end when the Eruv was finished in Manhattan, and it was written on the kuntras that Rav Moshkovich wrote to explain the Eruv in Manhattan. And he says, the second paragraph, it says, in Afki, Lamroi Sanal, as opposed to everything I wrote before, Samachti likros b'siyum hakuntas asher sachar mischiru lekitei chulu. I was happy to see he did Schiru Lekitei. If you look in that Kuntras, the section of Schiru Lekitei, which is Perek Yudalad over there, it's called Kuntras Tikkun Eiruvin. He only brings the Shittas, the most Mekel Dika Shittas over there, and obviously he went with the most Mekel Dika Shittas. The Rebbe says that I was happy to hear they did Schiru Lekitei, and the Rebbe adds something, Afki betach b'lei bracha, should do the Eruv without a bracha, Ehem shalei midei kama sfeikas layotza, there's some sfeikas over here. You have the fact is, there are some sfeikas in the matter. The fact is, the way we look at it, the best way of Schiru Lekitoi doesn't really exist. The best way of Schirus today, from Schiru Lekitoi of a Saroir, doesn't help. According to Alter Rebbe, according to Tzemach Tzedek. But ultimately, if the Rebbe said they shekach them for doing it, means if you have to do an Eruv in a city, and you're going to have to use kulas, So fine, you do it as long as you can't advertise about this specific Eruv. Now that is Siman Shin Tzadik Aleph. I'm not going to go into Siman Shin Tzadik Beis now. I think most people did not yet go through it. But in Shin Tzadik Beis, the discussions goes into what is considered a city of Rav, what is considered a city of a Yachid. There are different shittas in understanding what a city of a Yachid is, what a city of a Rabbim is, which we'll discuss in the next year. There is a Tzemach Tzedek in page 88 in your book, which brings the different shittas, and it's going to be worth it to look through it. Well, this will conclude this year.